Kale was quiet for a moment. You would put your name on a paper that says your own red line was in the wrong place? I would put my name on a paper that says the data led us to a better answer, said Vorak. That is what the name is supposed to be for. The human looked at him with an expression that took Vorak a moment to categorize because he had not often seen it on any species outside of his own. It was the expression of someone who had just decided to respect another person more than they had expected to. I would be honored to co-author, Kale said. Good. Vorak gathered his materials from the front row seat. You will also be completing the remaining 6 weeks of your coursework, submitting all outstanding assignments on schedule, and attending the practical sessions in the assessment chamber, which I will be supervising personally, because if you are volunteering for 2.0 gravity testing, I intend to be there with the measurement equipment when it happens. Kale smiled. It was the first time Vorak had seen the human smile, a full one, not the small contained expression from the classroom. It was, he noted, a remarkably confident smile for a creature whose species had spent thousands of years being quietly convinced by the universe that what they were doing was impossible. Wouldn't miss it, the human said. Vorak walked toward the exit of the symposium hall, past 400 researchers still discussing a supplementary paper that had rearranged 40 years of accepted science in 45 minutes. Past Maris, who was standing near the door wearing an expression that said she had known this was coming and had enjoyed every moment of it. Past the display at the entrance showing the Institute's motto in 7 galactic languages, understanding life as it is, not as we expect it to be. He thought about the red line. He thought about where it had been and where it was going. He thought about a human standing at 1.4 gravity, feeling faintly bored, deciding to add more weight. Professor Vorak Len had been wrong, that was clear, but standing in the doorway of the symposium hall, 43 years of teaching behind him and a revised framework ahead of him, he found he was not, despite everything, unhappy about it. Being wrong, it turned out, was the beginning of the most interesting research of his career, and somewhere behind him, Kale Runo was already adding more weight. Professor Vorak Len had been teaching xenobiology at the Galactic Institute of Evolutionary Sciences for 43 years. And in those 43 years he had never once been wrong. Not about the Quellian spine collapse, not about the Dorvan extinction model, not about the Brixie respiratory failure rates at high-pressure atmospheres. He had a record cleaner than a sterilized lab pod, and he wore that record the way some species wear their exoskeletons, proudly, loudly, and with absolutely zero room for anything that might crack it. So when the new semester's enrollment list landed on his desk and he saw the words human exchange student admitted under Galactic Accord Treaty, Planet of Origin, Earth, Gravity Classification 1.0 Standard Units, Professor Vorak Len did something he rarely did. He laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was the sort of laugh that comes from a creature who has read every death statistic ever recorded about a species and finds the optimism of their continued survival genuinely amusing. Maris, he said, calling across the faculty lounge to his junior colleague, a thin-limbed Peltravun named Maris Ove, who was carefully balancing 6 cups of nutrient broth on 2 of her 4 arms. They sent us a gravity worlder. Maris blinked her outer eyelids. From which category? 1.0. There was a pause. One of the nutrient cups wobbled. Maris caught it without looking. Is that a joke? I have the paperwork right here. Vorak held up the document like a trophy. One human, from a planet that actively tries to pull everything on its surface down into its own core at 9.8 meters per second squared every second, without rest, without mercy, without any evolutionary apology whatsoever. And this creature, he tapped the name on the file, this one called Kale Runo, has been granted a full semester at this institute. What are they studying? Comparative evolutionary physiology. Vorak set the file down and folded 2 of his primary limbs behind his thorax, which was his species' version of crossing one's arms smugly, which means they will be sitting in my classroom for 12 weeks, learning about why living under gravity like theirs should have killed their species before they ever developed language. Maris sat down slowly. And what happens when the student hears that? Vorak smiled with 3 of his 4 jaw segments. That, Maris, is the part I am genuinely looking forward to. The first day of class arrived the way first days always do at the Institute, with too many students, too much ambient noise from species whose communication frequencies overlapped uncomfortably, and the institutional smell of recycled atmosphere mixed with the faint chemical tang of 17 different biological preservation sprays. Professor Vorak Len entered the lecture chamber to find his students already seated. There were 12 of them in total. A Vorukan from the methane belt, bulky and slow-moving, wearing an atmospheric suit. 3 Peltrovan postgraduates sitting in the upper tier, a Galian, boneless and translucent, draped over a custom-fitted chair near the back, And there, in the third row, center seat, sat the human. Vorak had read the medical file, he had seen photographs, he had even, out of what he would later describe as professional curiosity and absolutely not morbid fascination, watched several hours of footage from Earth showing humans performing what they casually referred to as exercise, running, jumping, lifting objects that weighed as much as several of Vorak's students. He had reviewed all of that, and he had still not been fully prepared for the experience of seeing one in person. Kale Runo was, by the scale of most species in the room, medium-sized, not tall by any galactic standard, not particularly broad. The human sat in the chair the way most students sat, leaning forward slightly, a flat rectangular device on the desk in front of him, something called a notebook according to the file, and a cylindrical writing implement held loosely in one hand. He had brown skin, dark hair cut short on the sides, and an expression on his face that Vorak could only describe as relaxed alertness, the look of someone who was interested without being nervous. That last part bothered Vorak more than he expected. He set his materials on the front podium and looked at his class. "Good morning," he said in Standard Galactic, which all enrolled students were required to speak. "For those who have not attended this institute before, I am Professor Vorak Len. I hold the chair of Comparative Evolutionary Physiology. I have authored 62 peer-reviewed papers, and I am, by most credible measures, the foremost authority on how biological systems survive, adapt to, and fail under environmental pressure." He paused, emphasis, for today's purposes, on the word fail. He activated the lecture display behind him. A rotating diagram appeared, showing a planetary gravity curve plotted against biological survival data from 400 documented species. "Let us begin," he said, "with gravity." There was a soft ripple of movement in the room, the Gellian shifting position, the Vorukan adjusting its suit seals. "Gravity," said Vorak, "is without question the most patient killer in the known universe. It does not rush, it does not warn, it simply pulls constantly at every cell, every joint, every fluid-filled cavity in a living body, and it waits. It waits for the spine to compress, it waits for the cardiovascular system to overwork itself into failure. It waits for the skeletal load-bearing structures to degrade, and eventually, in almost every documented case, gravity wins." He clicked to the next slide. A chart appeared with species listed on one axis and gravity tolerance on the other, most clustered between 0.3 and 0.7 standard gravity units. A few outliers reached 0.9. The chart had a clear red line drawn at 1.0. "This line," said Vorak, pointing, "represents the threshold above which, according to every model my department has produced over 4 decades of research, no carbon-based species with a bilateral skeletal structure should be able to sustain multi-generational survival. Above this line you get bone density collapse, heart enlargement leading to cardiac failure, chronic joint degradation, and neurological pressure events caused by inadequate cerebrospinal fluid compensation." He tapped the red line 3 times. 1.0 standard gravity units. "Above this, we do not expect species to persist." He turned to face the room. "Can anyone tell me which planet in the surveyed galaxy sits precisely, not approximately precisely, at 1.0 standard gravity?" Silence. Then, from the third row, a hand went up, a human hand, 5-fingered, unhurried. "Earth," said Kale Runo in perfectly clear Standard Galactic with a slight accent that Vorak's translator tagged as regional and informal. "That would be my planet, Professor." "Correct," said Vorak. He looked at the student for one long moment with what he hoped was the expression of a scientist about to deliver a difficult truth, and not the expression of someone who had been preparing this particular moment since reading the enrollment list. "And yet," he said, letting the words sit, "here you are." Kale nodded. "Here I am. Thriving, apparently, despite every physiological model suggesting you should not exist in your current form. No exoskeleton, no pneumatic skeletal reinforcement, no distributed cardiovascular redundancy beyond a single primary pump, a spine that compresses under load, joints that wear down, a brain sitting in a cavity that depends almost entirely on fluid pressure to remain undamaged." Vorak spread his forelimbs wide. "Remarkable, is it not, that something so, let us be generous and say so elegantly minimalist in its design, survived not just 1 generation under those conditions, but thousands. Long enough to develop spaceflight, long enough to sign a galactic accord treaty, long enough to enroll in my class." A few students shifted. The Gellian made a low sound that the translator rendered as uncertain. Kale Runo had not moved. He was looking at the chart on the display behind Vorak, head tilted slightly, the writing implement turning slowly in his fingers. "Do you have a question?" Vorak asked. "Not yet," said the human. "I am still thinking about the red line. Vorak found that answer mildly unexpected. Most students, when spoken to in that particular tone, either became defensive or went very quiet. This one sounded, if anything, thoughtful. "Think as long as you like," said Vorak, turning back to the display. "You have a semester." The second week of classes went almost exactly as Vorak had expected, with one small exception. Cale Runo was, by any objective standard, an excellent student. He arrived early. He submitted assignments before the deadline, which placed him ahead of 9 of his 12 classmates. He asked questions, good questions, precise and structured, the kind that suggested he had not only read the assigned material but had cross-referenced it against something else. During the lab portion of the third session, when the class was working through skeletal load simulations, Cale had produced a secondary analysis comparing the model assumptions against actual observational data from Earth that Vorak had not included in the course materials, because Vorak had not believed it would be relevant to a class about how species manage gravity, not how one particularly stubborn species apparently refused to be managed by it. The analysis was technically correct. Vorak had stared at it for a long time before writing satisfactory at the top and returning it without comment. He told himself this said nothing about the red line. The red line was empirical. The red line was built on 4 decades of data. The red line did not care about one student's cross-reference supplementary reading. But then came the 4th week and the incident with the loading equipment. The institute had, adjacent to the main biology building, a series of physical assessment chambers used for studying how different species moved under varying gravity conditions. It was primarily research space, not open to students without supervision, but the equipment technician, a Peltrovan named Cav Sol, had apparently failed to update the access permissions after the new semester started. Vorak only found out what had happened because Maris came to find him in his office wearing an expression he had never seen on her face before. It was an expression that existed somewhere between professional concern and something that looked uncomfortably like awe. "You need to come see the assessment chamber logs from this morning," she said. "I am in the middle of reviewing simulation data." "Vorak," she said his name in a tone that made him put the data down. He followed her to the monitoring room adjacent to the chamber. She pulled up the morning's recordings. The timestamp showed 0600 hours, 2 hours before most of the institute's population was moving. On the screen, Cale Runo was in the chamber, alone, using the gravity loading equipment, which was calibrated at the time of the recording to 1.4 standard gravity units because it had last been used by a research team studying structural biology in high-gravity organisms, and Cav Sol had not reset it. 1.4. And Cale was lifting things, not struggling with them, not collapsing under them, which was the outcome every statistical model Vorak had built over 40 years would have predicted for a bilateral skeletal organism from a 1.0 world encountering 1.4. He was lifting equipment bars from a rack, pressing them above his head, setting them down, and then apparently deciding that was not sufficient and adding more weight. Vorak watched for a full 2 minutes in complete silence. "He did not know the calibration was wrong," Maris said quietly. "I checked with Cav. The display panel on that side of the chamber has a calibration fault. It shows the standard default reading. He thought he was working at 1.0. Vorak said nothing. "He was in there for 40 minutes, Maris continued. "He left, made a note in his personal log, and went to the canteen. I checked the canteen footage. He ate what looked like an enormous amount of food and then read something on his notebook for an hour." Vorak looked at the frozen frame on the monitor, the human standing in the chamber, arms relaxed, breathing steady, looking faintly bored. "Maris," he said after a long pause. "Yes? Update my course reading list. Add the complete Earth biomechanical archives. All of them." He straightened up. "I think I have been working from an incomplete dataset." Maris looked at him with the outer eyelid blink that meant she was choosing her words carefully. "Does this mean the red line is wrong?" Vorak turned and walked back toward his office. "It means," he said without turning around, "that I may have drawn it in the wrong place. The thing about being wrong when you are Professor Vorak Len is that it does not happen quietly. It does not arrive with a polite knock and a gentle suggestion that perhaps you might want to revise your position. It arrives the way most catastrophic realizations arrive, loudly, publicly, and at the absolute worst possible moment, which in this case was the annual Galactic Institute Symposium on Evolutionary Physiology, attended by 400 of the most distinguished biological researchers in the known galaxy, 3 separate press feeds, and 1 human exchange student who had, against all reasonable expectations, signed up to present a supplementary paper. Vorak had not known about the supplementary paper until the morning of the symposium. He had found out from the program schedule, which Maris had left on his desk with a small adhesive marker on page 7. The marker was red. He did not think that was a coincidence. The paper was titled, in perfectly formatted standard galactic academic style, Recalibrating the 1G Survival Threshold, a case study in observational bias and the danger of drawing conclusions without living subjects. Vorak read the title 3 times. Then he read it a 4th time, more slowly because his translator kept flagging the phrase observational bias and helpfully suggesting it was directed at someone specific, and his brain kept very politely suggesting that someone was him. He put the schedule down. He picked up his morning nutrient flask. He set it back down without drinking from it. He looked at the ceiling of his office, which was a pale institutional gray, and had nothing useful to say about any of this. "Maris," he called. "I already know," she called back from the adjacent room. "How long have you known?" A pause. "Since he submitted the abstract, 3 weeks ago." Vorak closed his outer eyelids slowly. "And you did not tell me." "I considered it," said Maris, appearing in the doorway with the particular expression of someone who had rehearsed this conversation and was mildly relieved it was finally happening. "But then I read the abstract, and I thought you should hear it in context, with an audience, because otherwise you might dismiss it." "I would not dismiss legitimate research." Maris said nothing. She did not need to. Vorak picked up the schedule again. He looked at the time slot for Kale Runo's supplementary paper. It was scheduled immediately after his own keynote address, which was titled 40 Years of Gravity Threshold Research, What the Data Tells Us. He stared at that particular piece of scheduling for a long moment. "Did he request that time slot?" "He did," said Maris. "On purpose, almost certainly." Vorak stood up. He gathered his keynote materials. He straightened his faculty robes, which was a thing he did when he was composing himself, and he walked toward the symposium hall with the energy of a creature who had decided that if he was going to be publicly corrected by a student from a planet that should not technically be producing students, he was going to walk into it with his head level and his jaw segments composed. The keynote went well. It always went well. Vorak had given versions of it, updated and refined, for 11 consecutive symposiums, and he knew exactly which data points made the audience lean forward, which visualizations produced the satisfying murmur of collective understanding, and which conclusions landed with the weight of things that had been proven so thoroughly that they no longer felt like conclusions but like facts of nature. The red line appeared on the main display at exactly the 32-minute mark, as it always did. 1.0 standard gravity, Vorak said, as he had said many times before, the threshold above which no bilateral skeletal organism with a single primary cardiovascular pump has been documented to survive multi-generational habitation. This line is not a hypothesis, it is a finding, built from 4 decades of observational data, cross-species physiological modeling, and longitudinal studies spanning 7 planetary systems. The audience was attentive. 400 researchers in a curved auditorium, various species arranged by atmospheric compatibility, all looking at the red line on the display with the focused interest of people who understood exactly what they were looking at. Vorak did not look at the 3rd row of the general seating section where his class had been allocated chairs. He did not need to. He was aware of where the human was sitting with a precision that had nothing to do with any of his scientific instruments. The implications of this threshold, he continued, are significant for the Galactic Accord's expanding contact protocols. When we encounter species from high-gravity worlds, we should not expect... He stopped, not because he had forgotten his notes. He never forgot his notes. He stopped because something had just occurred to him, standing in front of 400 researchers with the red line glowing behind him, that had not occurred to him in all the weeks since the assessment chamber incident, in all the hours he had spent reading Earth biomechanical archives, in all the quiet moments between sessions when he had been slowly, stubbornly, grudgingly revising his understanding of a species that refused to fit inside any model he had ever built. He had spent 40 years studying how species fail under gravity. He had not once spent 40 years studying how they do not. The silence in the auditorium stretched by approximately 2 seconds longer than was normal for a pause in a keynote address. 2 seconds is not very long by most measures. In an auditorium of 400 scientists, it is an eternity. Vorak looked at the red line. He thought about a recording of a human at 1.4 standard gravity, looking faintly bored. He thought about a supplementary paper with the phrase observational bias in the title. He thought about Kale Runo sitting in his class on the first day of semester, looking at the display with his head tilted slightly, the writing implement turning in his fingers, saying, "I am still thinking about the red line. The implications," Vorak said, more slowly this time, "may require revision." The murmur that moved through the auditorium was not the murmur of collective understanding. It was a different sound entirely. It was the sound of 400 scientists registering that something unexpected had just occurred. The supplementary presentation began at the 45-minute mark of the scheduled program. Kale Runo walked to the podium with the same unhurried, relaxed quality that Dvorak had noticed on the first day of class, the quality that looked, on the surface, like calm, but which Dvorak had spent several weeks privately reclassifying as something more specific. It was the particular composure of a creature that had spent its entire evolutionary history being the thing other things were wrong about. "Thank you for the time," Kale said in standard galactic, addressing the auditorium without apparent nervousness. He was holding a flat display tablet and wearing the kind of expression that suggested he had something to say and had been waiting for a reasonable moment to say it. "I want to be clear before I begin that this presentation is not a criticism of Professor Dvorak Len's research methodology. His data is correct. His analysis is correct. The models are built properly." He paused. "The problem is the question they were built to answer." He activated the display behind him. The familiar gravity curve appeared, the same one from Dvorak's keynote. The red line glowed at 1.0. "For 4 decades, Kale continued, the Institute's research into gravity thresholds has been structured around a single question: can species survive above this line? And the answer, based on the data collected, is generally no. Bilateral skeletal organisms at 1.0 and above show elevated rates of cardiovascular stress, skeletal compression, neurological pressure events, and multi-generational viability collapse." He looked at the line for a moment. The data is not wrong, but the question missed something. He clicked to the next slide. It was not a graph, it was a photograph. It was a photograph of a mountain range. Dvorak recognized the species of trees in the foreground from the Earth biological archives he had been reading for weeks. The peaks were high and sharp, the kind of geological formation that required significant tectonic activity to produce. The sky was a color that appeared on very few planets in the surveyed galaxy, a particular shade of blue that existed only in atmospheres with a specific oxygen-nitrogen ratio. "This is a place on Earth called the Himalayas," said Kale. "The highest mountain range on my planet. Humans live on the lower slopes of this range. They farm there, they trade there. They have entire civilizations built on terrain that, according to standard galactic altitude pressure models, should cause progressive hypoxic degradation in most known species within 72 hours. He let the photograph stay on screen. "They have been living there for thousands of years. The local population has adapted a measurably higher red blood cell density, expanded lung capacity, and a modified hemoglobin binding curve that allows for efficient oxygen transfer at pressures where most galactic species would be unconscious." A researcher near the front raised a secondary limb. "That is altitude adaptation documented in several species." "Yes," said Kale. "Under controlled conditions, over monitored generational periods, with populations large enough to track the selection pressure." He clicked to the next slide. "Humans did it without knowing they were doing it, without monitoring it, without any awareness that it was happening, because it happened over generations too long for any individual to observe." He looked at the audience. "My species does not adapt because conditions require it. My species adapts because conditions exist, and existing conditions are, to human biology, essentially a suggestion." The auditorium was very quiet. Kale clicked forward again. The new slide showed the assessment chamber log data. Dvorak recognized it immediately because he had been the one to pull it from the system. He had not, however, expected it to appear in a student presentation at the annual symposium. 6 weeks ago, Kale said, his tone entirely conversational, "I used the Institute's physical assessment chamber. The calibration display on my side of the equipment had a fault. I was working at what I believed was standard 1.0 gravity." He paused, 1 beat, perfectly timed. It was 1.4. The murmur from the auditorium this time was considerably louder. "I felt heavier than usual," Kale continued. "I thought I was tired. I added more weight to compensate, because that is the human response to feeling like something is harder than expected. You add more weight until it feels right." He said this completely without irony, which somehow made it worse, or better. Dvorak could not entirely decide. "I did not discover the calibration error until Professor Len's colleague reviewed the chamber logs. When I was told what the actual gravity setting had been, my first response, which I acknowledge was not scientific, was that this explained why I had been hungry afterward." Several species in the auditorium made sounds that Dvorak's translator flagged as laughter. Even the Galian, boneless and translucent in the back row, produced a low vibration that registered as amusement. Kale waited politely for the sounds to settle. "The point," he said when they had, "is not that I am exceptional. I am not. By human standards, I am average. There are humans who train at altitude, who compete in endurance events lasting multiple days, who spend careers working in physical conditions that most galactic species would classify as emergency situations. They are not unusual among my species. They are, by human measure, moderately dedicated. Another pause. The survival threshold models are accurate for species that encountered gravity as a challenge. Humans did not encounter gravity as a challenge. We were born inside it. We grew inside it. Every system in our bodies was shaped by it, not despite it, but because of it, and then we went looking for steeper mountains to climb. He clicked to his final slide. It was the same gravity curve as before, the red line at 1.0, but on this version, Cale had added a second line, a dotted one, further to the right. It sat at 2.0 standard gravity units, and next to it, in small clean text, were the words current estimated human upper threshold under investigation. I am not here to remove Professor Len's red line, Cale said. I am here to suggest it applies to species that have the option to leave. Humans never had that option. We stayed, and the gravity stayed, and after enough generations, the gravity stopped winning. He set the tablet down. I look forward to any questions. There were many questions. They lasted 1 hour and 40 minutes, which was the longest post-presentation question period in the recorded history of the symposium. Vorak knew this because the session moderator, a Peltravan administrator named Ral Cove, mentioned it twice, in a tone of increasing bewilderment. Vorak sat in the front row and listened to all of it. He did not interrupt, he did not correct. He asked one question, near the end, and it was not a challenge, it was a genuine question, the kind he asked when he encountered data that changed the shape of something he thought he understood. The second line, he said, at 2.0 standard gravity units. How was that estimate derived? Cale looked at him across the auditorium. His expression was the same one from the first day of class, interested without being nervous. Preliminary testing, the human said. Voluntary, institutional ethics approval pending. A small pause. I am one of the volunteers. Vorak nodded slowly. After the session ended, when the auditorium was emptying and researchers were gathering in small groups to discuss what they had just heard, Vorak found himself standing beside Cale near the display, both of them looking at the slide with the 2 lines on it, the solid red one and the dotted one further to the right. You have been planning this since the first week, Vorak said. It was not an accusation, it was an observation. Since the first day, Cale said, which was more accurate and therefore more uncomfortable. When you described the red line and said it was empirical, I wanted to check the empirical basis. The data was solid, but the sample population had a gap. Humans, Cale confirmed. You had never included us because there was no data yet. There was no data because no human had enrolled in a course at the Institute before. He glanced sideways at Vorak. Galactic Accord treaties take a long time to negotiate. Vorak looked at the dotted line. 2.0, he said. You believe that is achievable? I believe it is worth finding out. The human's tone was entirely calm. That is, generally speaking, the human answer to most questions. Vorak considered that for a moment. 40 years of research, 400 peer-reviewed papers, a record he had been proud of for reasons that now seemed, if not wrong exactly, then considerably less complete than he had imagined them to be. Cale Runo, he said. Professor, your supplementary paper will require a formal response from my department. Peer review, counter-analysis, institutional verification of all cited data. He turned from the display to look at the human directly. It will be the most thorough review of a student submission in the history of this institute. Cale nodded. I expected that, and when it is complete, Vorak continued, I intend to co-author a revised framework for gravity threshold assessment, incorporating the Earth biomechanical dataset in full, correcting the population gap in the original models, and formally reclassifying the 1.0 threshold as a species variable finding rather than a fixed limit.